Greetings, AP U.S. History Scholars, for our review on Unit 12, which is on the Roaring Twenties, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom. Some thoughts on the 20s here. The Red Scare and the Palmer Raids and the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. After World War I in the United States, there's what we call the Red Scare, or the fear of communism, or the fear of Bolshevism, as it was called in Russia after Lenin took over Russia in 1917. There is the promise of Lenin to spread the revolution, and there's the fear in the United States that revolutionaries are in our midst. And you have the Palmer Raids, which on New Year's Eve 1919, New Year's Day 1920, you see the raid by the U.S. government by A. Mitchell Palmer, who is the Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department, raids socialist offices in 33 U.S. cities and rounds up hundreds of socialists, and several hundred of them will be deported back to Russia. And what's going on in this time period is there's economic dislocation as the economy is moving from a direction to producing war goods to going back to civilian items. You have a period in 1919 of inflation and a lot of strikes, the highest number of Americans involved in strikes in our history. About 1 out of 5 Americans will walk the picket line. And a lot of these strikers are being painted with the brush of anarchism and liberalism and socialism and what have you. And you do have radicals such as the IWW, the Wobblies, who are socialists. So the fear is that this agitation is coming from overseas. And you see a reaction to our involvement in World War II in post-World War I isolationism. The United States does not sign the Versailles Treaty. And remember, there's this fear of getting sucked into a future war by the League of Nations, which would have a call on American troops for police action overseas. And the U.S. Senate does not ratify the Versailles Treaty, which Wilson had signed. You also see in 1921 an Emergency Quota Act, which reduces the number of immigrants to 3% of the number that came over in 1910. And in 1924, you have the National Origins Act, which further reduces the number of immigrants to only 2% of those who came over in 1890. And the point of pushing this date backwards is the farther back you go, the less new immigrants, the less immigrants from Central, Southern, and Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe you're going to have coming over. So basically reducing the number of Italians and Poles and Jews and Catholics and those types that are sort of flooding into the eastern seaboard cities. You also have the Washington Naval Conference, and this is in the 20s, and this is basically a disarmament agreement where we are going to be building, taking apart, settling torches, taking apart the USS South Carolina battleship, turning it into scrap. The specific 5-power agreement is a ratio of 5 to 5 British to American ships to 3 Japanese ships, 1 to 1 French and Italian ships. What's going to happen is the Japanese are going to build up and we're going to build down. But the point here is to avoid warfare by limiting construction of the tonnage of these state-of-the-art battleships and cruisers and destroyers. There's also a 9-power agreement respecting the sovereignty of China and a 4-power treaty, which is basically the big colonial powers in the Pacific agreeing not to prey upon each other's colonies. Remember the Versailles Treaty. It's on the review sheet here. I already mentioned it here in passing. But when the Republicans are debating the Versailles Treaty, Henry Cabot Lodge, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, has what are called the reservations. And this would be the Republican-controlled Senate would sign off on the Versailles Treaty with the condition that the right to go to war would be reserved by the United States Congress, and Wilson will have none of this. He believes it basically strips the League of Nations of any power. And Senator Borah is the leader of the irreconcilables, those who will under no condition sign the Versailles Treaty or join the League of Nations. But the Versailles Treaty does not pass the U.S. Congress, and we sign a separate peace agreement with the Germans later. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial is an example of this fear of of new immigrants, of radicals. And this is a controversial trial. Generally, my read on history books is that Sacco and Vanzetti are tried not for what they did. Supposedly, they robbed some payroll security guards and killed these two guys and took their money, and they're arrested. And there's some sketchy business with witnesses and prejudice by the judge. But there's, I won't get into the details here. I think that these guys are guilty, but the attitude towards the American public and the presiding judge is that these guys are really being tried because they are Italian immigrants, because they're atheists, because they're anarchists, because they're draft dodgers. They went off to Mexico to avoid being drafted. Keep in mind, the army that we draft in World War I is about 20% immigrants, the children of immigrants. And these guys, again, are Italians. So these guys are eventually executed in 1927 on what many people consider to be sort of a kangaroo trial. 1920s, 3 Republican presidents that you should know, and these correspond to the 3 progressive presidents in the early 1900s, which are Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. The pendulum swings in the 20s away from progressivism to conservatism, to sort of laissez-faire conservatism under Warren G. Harding. He dies in office, and then followed by Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. And what characterizes this return to normalcy is isolationism, higher tariffs, lower taxes, less government regulation, restriction on immigration, saying no to Versailles, no to foreign entanglements, cutting government spending, and generally seeking peace through the Washington Naval Conference and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is signed in the 1920s. 40 nations agree not to use war as an instrument of foreign policy. Basically, these nations pledge themselves to peace. Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association is an organization created by this Jamaican immigrant, Marcus Garvey, dedicated to racial pride and economic self-sufficiency and the formation eventually of an independent black African nation. He sets up the Black Star Lines, and the plan is to ship black Americans back to Africa. And he's a critic of the NAACP, which is advocating, in Garvey's eyes, assimilation, basically becoming like the whites, asking for the social equality. And Garvey is basically, he's advocating black pride. Be proud in who you are, and patronize, black businesses and black stores. And this is kind of some defiance here at a time when there in 1920, there is a lot of lynching. There are race riots across the country in 1919, and the Ku Klux Klan is going to grow to its largest number, about 4 million in the 1920s. And the largest Klan group is not in the South, it's going to be in the state of Indiana. So you have Marcus Garvey. Now he's in the North, he's in New York City, and he's sort of a predecessor of some of the Black Pride movement that's going to come out of the 1950s and 60s. What was the Prohibition Amendment, or why was the Prohibition Amendment ratified in the 1920s? Keep in mind, a lot of things are happening here as it's in the process of being ratified during World War I. It's part of this anti-German hysteria. A lot of the breweries here are of German background, so it's a blow against the Germans and German Americans. It's part of the sacrifice for war. Keep in mind that the Prohibition Amendment is going to be very strong in the rural Western Protestant, Southern Protestant states. And there's this, teetotalerism in Protestantism, that drunkenness is a sin and that it leads to violence, it leads to sexual promiscuity, it leads to poverty as men gamble away or spend the money that should go to their families. But this amendment also has an anti-immigrant component. Remember, this is time when we're shutting the door by the National Origins Amendment in 1924, and these immigrants are the ones who are, setting up bars and saloons and acting bad in the cities and forming gangs and mafia and this sort of thing. So there's an anti-immigrant edge to this amendment. And you have the suffragists, women who at this time still do not have full access to universities and jobs and to freedom. alcohol harms families in ways which women suffer the most. So there's a lot of different reasons for backing the Prohibition Amendment. Also, remember, the populists want to tax the wealthy. You get this income tax amendment. Well, before the income tax amendment, about 20% of the government's money is coming from taxing booze. So if you get rid of booze, where are you going to get this money from? So you have this balance here. So populism is one thing that's pushing prohibition, as is progressivism. You've got this idea that the city governments under the bosses, under these machine politics, are being sort of corrupted by immigrants, and this is a slap politically against immigrants as well as their religious and their social behavior. Henry Ford, most of you probably know Henry Ford and the assembly line, the creator of the Model T, and over a period of about a decade, he's going to bring the price of the Model T down by about 2/3, from the $900s to the $300 range. So he's going to make the car, the Model T, available to the everyman. And he's famous for saying you can have it in any color you want as it's black. Point being, he's making sort of a very uniform car with, you don't get a lot of options here. Frederick Taylor, you should know Frederick Taylor is this efficiency expert who develops this idea of industrial engineering, and his book is The Principles of Scientific Management. And Taylor is a guy who, along with Ford, is emphasizing efficiency and productivity in industry. And Henry Ford, with his assembly line, is going to bring the pieces to the worker and not the worker to the pieces. And you're going to have this car is going to go from weeks to being created in just hours. Women of the 1920s, how are they freer? Well, keep in mind here, women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. During World War I and after, more women are working outside of the home. And you have the symbol of the free woman of the 20s, and that's the flapper. And the flapper is this urban woman who is smoking, who's drinking, who's dancing to Charleston, and who's independent, basically acting like a man. Now keep in mind, most women in the 20s are conservative. Most women are not flappers, but flappers represent this another jarring disruption in the 20s of women sort of stepping out of their historic place. How was the progressive era different from the 1920s? Well, remember, the progressive era is an era of government regulation. Think of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Reserve Act and the Elkins and Hepburn Acts, which are going to give the ICC the right to regulate and to ban rebates. And you have the anti-child labor with the Owen Keatings. And what's happening here in the 20s is you've got government regulation is going to run up against laissez-faire. You're going to have raising taxes, perhaps with the income tax amendment under the progressives, with cutting taxes under the presidents in the 20s. Increase of regulation is going to be contrasted here with the decrease of government regulation. Child labor laws versus Hammer-Dagenhart, which is the Supreme Court case which is going to strike down the regulation on child labor. You've got lowering the tariffs under Woodrow Wilson with the Underwood tariff, with raising the tariffs. By the time we get to the 30s, we have the highest tariffs in American history. So the 20s are very, very conservative compared to the progressive era. Remember, Calvin Coolidge has got these quips. The man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. And the business of America is business. And Calvin Coolidge is famous, and I don't know off the top of my head if any other presidents have done this since him, but when he leaves office, he has reduced the grand total of government spending over his term of office, which is really an amazing thing, but it shows his principle here that government should be pared down rather than further empowered, which is something the progressives pushed in this era. The Scopes monkey trial is part of this struggle over evolution. Remember, John Scopes broke the Tennessee law that says you cannot teach evolution as science in the classroom, and he is convicted, but the fundamentalists, the Christians, end up looking like rubes, looking like bumpkins, looking unscientific, anti-progressive, and basically dumb. And just a piece of note here, he is convicted, but on a technicality, the conviction is thrown out because the judge imposed the fine rather than the jury. But it shows this increase in the significance of the city, of the coast over the countryside, the rural areas. It shows the growth of the secular against the the sacred against the Protestant traditional. The Harlem Renaissance, flowering of African American music and art and literature in Harlem, New York in the 1920s. Think of Langston Hughes, the poet. Think of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. Think of the Cotton Club. You think of jazz. And jazz is this music that comes out of the black community. It crosses over into white listenership. And jazz is associated at this time with promiscuity, with immorality, with independence, with anti-authoritarianism. So jazz is kind of controversial, kind of like down the road rock and maybe rap is. That's what jazz is in the 1920s. And again, on the end of the review sheet here, racial tensions after World War I. You have race riots across the country. You have lynchings. You have the growth of the Ku Klux Klan. You have the 1924 National Origins Act. And there's some thoughts here on the 1920s. So to my class, study, know this stuff, and you'll do great. Signing out.